Good afternoon, everyone. It's top of the hour, and we are eager to get started on this ambitious topic. So on behalf of the UC Disaster Resilience Network, UC-DRN for short, the UC Berkeley Center for Security and Politics, and the California Council on Science and Technology, CCST for short, I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for being here for this important and timely discussion. My name is Julianne McCall. I'm the CEO of CCST, and I'd like to open our briefing today by acknowledging first that we are participating from different locations in what we now call the state of California, which is home to many indigenous communities who've stewarded this land since time immemorial. CCST is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization established in the 80s at the request of the legislature. CCST was created to provide science technology advice directly to policymakers from the outstanding community of academic and research institutes in our state. California is so incredibly lucky to have such a network of expertise, and our job at CCST is to help amplify and translate that expertise in this network into actionable advice and practical advice for policymakers. We do this through a number of mechanisms, including briefings like the one you're attending today. We also host workshops, write peer-reviewed reports, and run the CCST Science Fellows Program, which entails placing PhD-level scientists and engineers in the executive branch and the legislature for a year of government service and leadership training. So this webinar is the first event of a year-long series showcasing experts on extreme disasters and climate change and their impacts on human mobility. Recently, this topic has grown increasingly important given the devastating impacts of the LA fires in January, together with many other extreme events across the country. These events call us to think critically about the human, economic, and environmental impacts of these tragic events, and they serve as a reminder of just how much still remains to be done to build resilience across our state of California. So I'd like to thank our wonderful partners who've been thoughtful collaborators in every sense of the term, the UC-DRN and the UC Berkeley Center for Security and Politics. I'd also like to take a moment to recognize Jesse Keenan as a replacement for Fauna Foreman, who's fallen ill, unfortunately, and couldn't join us today. We look forward to engaging Fauna in a future briefing, so please stay tuned for all of you looking forward to seeing her. But a special thank you, especially to Jesse. First, I will turn it over to Dr. Leroy Westerling, Chair of the UC-DRN Council, to say a few words. Dr. Westerling.
Thank you and welcome, everyone. I'm Professor at UC Merced and Chair of the UC Disaster Resilience Council. The UC Disaster Resilience networks are knowledge communities, our funding communities, and our communities of practice to build up resilience to climate and other disasters in our communities, to get our science more closely aligned with public needs, and to demonstrate the value of what we do for each other. We have a particular focus on compound disasters, those whose complexity and impacts make them some of the most challenging risks to manage. UC-DRN spans the 10 campuses of the UC system, 3 national labs, UC Health, and the UC Natural Reserve System, and numerous community stakeholders throughout the state. Our initiatives include research and international partnerships, developing around wildfires, seismology, coastal resilience, and security, with partners such as the UC Natural Reserve System and universities around the Pacific Rim. A project developing a searchable database of disaster resilience expertise across the UC system with partners in EY, Microsoft for Good, and the UCSD Supercomputer Disaster Resilience Database. Finally, we are participating and leading ongoing development and delivery of online system-wide educational offerings, in addition to campus-specific courses, building towards a hybrid curriculum in disaster resilience studies with UC Online at the Office of the UC President. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing what comes of today's meeting.
Thank you so much, Professor Westerling. Next, I'd like to hand the microphone to Angelina Soldados, Associate Director of the UC Berkeley Center for Security and Politics, for additional opening remarks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Angelina Soldatos, and I am the Associate Director for the Center for Security and Politics here at UC Berkeley. Founded by former Secretary of Homeland Security and former University of California President Janet Napolitano, our center's mission focuses on addressing critical national and global security challenges surrounding climate change, democracy, and technology by bridging academia with the public and private sector and providing innovative, actionable solutions for policymakers. We are elated to be a part of this timely conversation alongside our partners at UCDRN and CCST, and looking forward to this robust conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both for your collaborative partnership on the planning of this series. So today we're focusing on climate change impacts on human mobility and how the displacement of people has far wider implications than initially realized. So I would now like to introduce our fearless moderator, Doug Parsons. Doug is the founder and host of America Adapts, the climate change podcast, one of the world's leading podcasts dedicated to climate adaptation. Through his podcast, Doug has interviewed hundreds of experts, from top scientists and policymakers to grassroots leaders and others, bringing critical adaptation conversations to a global audience. Before launching America Adapts, Doug built a career in climate adaptation, working in Queensland, Australia, on agricultural climate impacts before becoming Florida's first climate change coordinator at the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. He later served as a climate change liaison for the National Park Service and as North America Policy Director at the Society for Conservation Biology. Now through America Adapts, Doug continues to amplify the voices of those driving adaptation solutions. Thank you so much for moderating this webinar, Doug.
Thank you, Julianne. Appreciate it. And there's just a little bit of fear. It's not completely fearless here. So first off, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate this incredibly important panel. And I just want to thank you for doing this. You know, obviously, we're just recognizing in these times, we need this leadership, looking to California to take a leading role in having these climate change conversations. So thank you for that. So this is a kickoff to a series where we're bringing together top experts from climate science, economics, politics, and migration studies to dig into the big questions: why are people moving? How is it happening? And where are they going as climate and disaster risks shift? We'll explore these trends not just in California, but across the U.S. and at a global scale. And so we have this incredible panel here that I'm going to be asking questions. Hopefully get some questions from you too. But I'm going to get started, let them introduce themselves. But first off, I've got Dr. Daniel Swain from UCLA. Daniel, you out there?
I am indeed. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Daniel Swain. I'm a climate scientist with University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources, as well as UCLA and the NSF Center, National Center for Atmospheric Research. So a few different hats these days. You may have seen me in the media or social media sphere, but my job really is to consider climate change through an extreme weather and increasingly a disaster lens. So thinking about how episodic weather and climate extremes, as well as weather adjacent extremes, maybe we'll call them, like wildfire, are changing in a warming climate, and what we can do to potentially offset some of those risks. I also spend a lot of time speaking with the public at large in a bunch of different formats. And so feel free to reach out to me after this event if you want to hear more.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. And I think Daniel's being a little modest. He's a media rock star, and check out his Weather West blog. It's just a go-to resource. All right, up next, and just up the highway from me, I'm in Tucson, Arizona, is Dr. Valerie Moeller, an associate professor at Arizona State University. Valerie, you out there?
Yes, hi, my name's Valerie. I'm trained as an economist, and I tend to do a lot of climate modeling outside of the US. And recently I've been working on climate migration modeling within the US with Matt Hauer. And I'm not into, so I mean, I don't do a lot of public speaking, so that's all. I'm happy to answer questions, but I don't have much more to say.
But here you are on this panel, so we are going to ask you questions. All right, and finally, and this is exciting for me, is Dr. Jesse Keenan at Tulane University, a recurring guest on America Adapts. Hey, Jesse, how are you?
Hey, I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Jesse Keenan at Tulane University. I'm an urban planner, and I cover real estate, housing, infrastructure, and within the broader realm of how people make decisions, investments, and the associated behaviors, material design systems, whatever it may be, associated with adaptation of the built environment, planning, regulation, financing, and the like. I've covered human mobility in terms of everything from consumer preferences to broader aspects of how municipal finance and market economies drive and shape our decisions, choices, options, sorting patterns, whatever it may be. So I'm deeply invested in the idea of human mobility in the context of climate change for all of its challenges and opportunities. And so thank you very much for having me.
All right, Jesse, I'm going to stick with you and let's just ground people more. You talked about it a little bit, but how would you define climate disaster-driven human mobility, and why is it referred sometimes as displacement or migration? Let's give people that 30,000-foot view as we kind of really dig into this, the kind of fundamentals. You're sitting on the bus and having to explain this to someone.
I think the best way to think about this in terms of human mobility is to think about who are the various cohorts that we're really talking about. It's not just disasters. It's not just episodic events of shock. There's also a broad range of stresses when we think about climate change. And so I think the best way to think about this is that, sure, on one end of the continuum, we have people who are episodically displaced. They lose a home, they become displaced from a community, and they relocate or migrate somewhere else for a variety of different reasons, opportunity, they can't rebuild, they in terms of affordability, wealth, whatever it may be, they're displaced, period. On the other end of the continuum, we have people who have the elective mobility to move, right? And we have people who are making choices because they have the labor mobility skills, they have the accumulated wealth, they have the capacity to be able to move somewhere else. And they're doing so because they want to plant roots in a community for the long term. They're doing so, and this is true, certainly we know, or we have evidence to this effect in terms of retirees and even younger people who are more giving consideration to their fixed income and their life choices in where they build a home and a community. So somewhere in between the shock of the displaced and the stress that is shaping where people electively go are a variety of different cohorts. Some people circumstantially sort themselves by virtue of making trade-offs between risk of loss in lower rents, for instance, and higher risk areas. And so it's not so clear that to me, and I think the broader academy who thinks about this in terms of human mobility, that it's just people getting forced out. There's a much broader category of people who are making decisions that speak to the messiness and the complexity of the push and pull of how we decide where we want to live and how we want to live.
Okay, great. Valerie, I'm going to go to you now. And so you are a researcher. Why is this challenge particularly important to researcher and hopefully ultimately to policymakers too? Why is this so important?
I mean, I'm going to talk, I would say a lot of it is measurement. Jesse sort of talked about the theory behind why people move and sort of what are some of the obstacles and what are some of the facilitators. But I think there's sort of two things that make it challenging. One is sort of measurement of mobility. And I think it's much easier to measure sort of displacement around some disasters over some slow onset events. So for example, we have a lot of techniques that use remote sensing. We can also use call detail records like cellular phone activity to measure massive population movements before and after a cyclone. But it's much more difficult to measure mobility around a drought, let's say. And also in the U.S. versus outside of the U.S., there are a lot more insurance. There's a lot more infrastructure to prevent people from moving from, say, a slow onset drought. So I think that's the first challenge, is sort of the issue of measurement. The second challenge has to do with what's the role of policies on affecting mobility. What's the role of housing insurance? Housing insurance or flood insurance or different types of insurance sort of keep people living in vulnerable areas. And that sort of creates this moral hazard problem. There are all other types of policies or mechanisms out there that sort of protect and keep people in place. So I think the challenge is finding out to what extent those, insurance is going to be one of those things that slowly is changing the availability of insurance. And so it will be more and more interesting to see how mobility patterns change in the U.S. once insurance becomes less readily available. And I think that California in itself will be, all eyes will be on California as fewer and fewer people are able to get things like insurance for specific disasters.
Well, I like to think it's probably happening faster than you realize, and Florida will take you to task. Things are happening very quickly there too, my home state. Daniel, I want to talk about climate modeling and how can that help us better understand and anticipate patterns of human migration? You're the modeler. How can they take this information that people like you are doing and help inform these decisions?
Well, I think one of the most important things from a physical science perspective in this respect is really to ask the right questions, sort of in line with what we were just hearing, that you can't really quantify what you don't measure, or what's difficult to quantify if it's difficult to measure. I think the same extends to data from climate models and from other sorts. Even just simple observations about how the world has changed so far are often not so simple. It's often difficult to discern exactly how the risks have increased in certain places, either sort of in the background or the risk of individual episodic extremes. Either way, sort of the chronic or the acute part of that, the broader problem of disruption from climate change leading to displacement of people in some setting. And so I think the question is, how can we, ask the right questions with the kind of physical science data, the climate model data, the climate observational data that actually exists in a way that is scientifically justifiable, which is not just an academic, we need to have 95th percentile certainty. It really does matter in terms of the tangible interpretation of what is happening and why, and maybe more importantly, what we should do about it. And, an example of this is in California. I think for a long time, there was just this prevailing expectation that the climate would become perennially drier. Not necessarily based on climate science, actually, but it's just sort of a gut feeling almost that I think pervaded certain assumptions and decisions that were made at a state level, maybe more than it should have historically. Whereas really today, what we recognize is one of the challenges is that we can't just look to average precipitation to tell us a lot about how California's hydroclimate will change. In fact, there's high uncertainty as to whether California's annual average precipitation will decrease or increase or not really change at all, perhaps, in a warming climate. But in fact, if you look at the aspects of California's hydroclimate where we have more confidence, will the driest dries become drier or the wettest wets wetter, corresponding respectively to drought or flood risk, or in the transition between the two, wildfire risk? The answer is yes, even in an environment where we don't necessarily have a good sense of what's happening on average. And so this gets, into the weeds a little bit about how whether the tools we're using to ask these questions from a physical science purpose are necessarily fit for that purpose. Sometimes the answer is no. And also, even where and when they are we actually asking, are we interrogating the data correctly? Are we asking the specific question that we actually care about? If we care about drought or flood risk, we can't look to average trends in precipitation to tell us what we need to know about those physical hazards, and therefore what we need to know about how it's affecting human migration.
All right, thanks. Jesse, I'm going to go back to you, and you probably better know than anyone else. We have all these national adaptation plans around the world, and I think even the U.S. recently submitted theirs, although implementation, it'll be up to what's going to happen there. How are those plans doing when it comes to addressing human migration? Are they talking internally, externally? Are they even talking about it much? I mean, I know you can't talk about all of them, but just more broadly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. I just want to go very quickly back to what Daniel was saying, as well as Valerie. I think one of the challenges we have is, of course, there is discrete observations and as well as our own perceptions. And this is the challenge of social science in ways to understand how those perceptions shape our behavior. And in many ways, we have increasingly robust inferential research that suggests that people are already moving and making decisions associated with how and where they're going to live. And we can't necessarily so easily, nor is it necessarily so desirable, to disaggregate climate from all the other aspects of human mobility in that interaction and the role that climate impacts rather play in how we assess affordability and security and opportunity across a broad spectrum of considerations. So I think we really kind of have to zoom out in that regard and understand that fundamental challenge. But that doesn't necessarily, and I think Daniel's spot on, I think we often try to create a kind of logical construct between our understanding of physical risk and impact and its distribution and the like, and assume that there's some kind of actually rational behavior that adjudicates risk and opportunity among people's behaviors and consumption. And that's certainly a challenge for public policy, is to understand where that goes, where that happens, where it doesn't happen, and the friction in between. So measurement is key, but on some level, it's also paralyzing us in terms of what we already understand to be some substantive considerations in a broader trend. Now, relating to national adaptation plans and adaptation planning around the world, and you look at those plans through the lens of human mobility, what we see are relocation plans and formal relocation plans of infrastructure. So I would say that the predominant orientation, and this is dozens of countries throughout the world, have been saying, okay, listen, we recognize we have a very high risk geography. The long-term viability in terms of capital or operational expenses with maintaining this is just, it's not viable for a lot of different reasons. We're going to move infrastructure, and hopefully people will move with that infrastructure. We're going to move housing, and hopefully people will move with it. A very few countries are looking at this from a social services point of view or at a household level subsidization. Most of them are looking at this really from a structural sort of developmental point of view, and urban development in many cases. So there is a lot of things happening. There is a lot of advancement and innovation. In Sudan, for instance, they're really thinking about moving agricultural systems to the south in a much more amenable climate for agriculture. But they also fundamentally recognize that, across a broad range of ecosystem services and a broader ecological system, it's not so easy. It's not just about the material systems of irrigation, for instance, and animal husbandry that have to adapt in their spatial and capital accumulation and locations. It's a much more multi-sector approach that they have to take to understand transition over a phased period of time. So there is a lot of activity. I think it generally can be summarized as fitting within existing models of development and developmental logics that go back to sustainable development pathways for financial resourcing. So in a way, they're sort of tracking onto where money has gone historically and where project financing has gone in developmental terms. And that's not necessarily the best way to do it, but people follow the money, even in a broader global aspect. But I would say that there is advancement, and people are certainly experimenting, often out of necessity, particularly in the South Pacific.
All right, thanks, Jesse. And Valerie, I want to bring you into that. I want to relate it to the national adaptation plans. But the question I have for you is that you've done quite a bit of work in Africa, and correct me where I'm not explaining this properly. And can you share how gender can inform adaptation planning regarding human migration? And did you see, I guess, even in your work in Africa, did those national adaptation plans get down to, I guess, to the community level? Was that even discussed?
Okay, so I'm not so familiar with all the national adaptation plans of Africa, so I can't really speak so much to that. But I can talk a little bit about gender and migration if you'd like me to. Otherwise,
Yeah.
I can defer. Okay, so
No, yeah, please.
it's very you can't really think about migration in Africa or climate migration in Africa without thinking about it through a gender lens, because the motives for moving differ. If you think about using migration as an adaptation strategy, a lot of the moves for women are sort of associated with marriage moves, whereas with men, it's more often sort of moving in order to get work elsewhere or less vulnerable work outside of the agricultural sector. So I think one of the types of one big area of my research right now is trying to figure out how, if marriage isn't necessarily a bad thing, marriage and migration is not necessarily a bad thing, but one of the implications of using marriage as a way of dealing with adaptation is that oftentimes families marry their daughters a little too soon, right? In order to have fewer mouths to feed, or in order to have a bride price or a bride payment, which happens in a lot of these customs. And so one of the things that I'm trying to work on is sort of what policies do we need in order to protect young women from these maladaptive practices. And so some of the things that I'm looking into are social assistance and social protection programs that are already in place targeting poor households, but seeing to what extent do those types of programs benefit women in terms of reducing the impacts on them from poor adaptation strategies.
Okay, great. Daniel, I'm going to go over to you now. And so what kind of modeling improvements or innovations could better support decision makers as they start thinking about human mobility? There's climate models out there, but I mean, there's just probably always a need for improvement.
Well, I think one of the challenges we've seen, and this is part of the reason why we've seen such turmoil in the insurance sector in places like California and Florida in recent years, is that we don't even have a great handle in some cases on what the background risks are in certain places. And we often assume that societies and individual locations are sort of accustomed to whatever the range of Mother Nature can throw at a particular place by virtue of having been there for a century or so. But I think sometimes we often find that even that sort of sample size, that historical record, is not enough to fully give us a sense of what's possible and the kinds of things that we need to build and maintain or rebuild, in some cases, resilience to in the first place. Now, climate change compounds that by upping the ante and making a lot of these natural hazards worse even than they were before. But I think we see this to sort of extend one of Jesse's earlier points to use the example of specific episodic disasters. We're talking about, for example, the recent devastating pair of wildfires in Los Angeles. Clearly, there's a climate change component here. It's not that climate change was irrelevant, but also I think the main reason why there was so much loss and why there will be so much sudden displacement in these events isn't itself a climate change problem. It's everything else about the societal vulnerability, the fact that we have all of these people living in high-risk zones that have been high risk ever since these subdivisions were built in the first place. It's not really a mystery. We do have climate change coming along and making that risk even worse and realizing that latent potential more often than we used to. But I think the real question is, if we want to do better, if we want to use climate information to prevent these kinds of disasters from unfolding, at least with the frequency and intensity that they have started to recently in places like this, and this is true as well for hazards in other places in the U.S. like hurricanes or other parts of the world like droughts and famines, is also to figure out to be a little bit more circumspect about the range of what's possible and to think differently about how we generate that kind of information as well as forward-looking climate projections. They're both really important. I know it's something that the insurance sector is increasingly thinking about, is how do we not just sort of wildly extrapolate from our limited historical record to tell us what we need to be prepared for, but also how do we get a better handle on the fact we live on a big complex planet where natural hazards can sometimes throw us for a loop, even without climate change. And now we do have climate change coming along and making that an even more complicated problem. So in terms of next steps, I mean, I don't think there's a single one that's really obviously the single most important. I think it really is continuing to refine our ability to understand the underlying physical processes at planetary scale. There are still some surprisingly large uncertainties there, like, for example, what's going to happen with the El Nino Southern Oscillation. That's a really important thing, not just for California water or California wildfire or Florida hurricanes, but for famines in Africa. I mean, this is a globally significant pattern, and we're still not quite sure how exactly that might evolve in a warming world. So we know, of course, the world is warming. We know why it's warming. We know that's a problem. It's exacerbating existing problems. But I think that there's sort of this multi-pronged approach in terms of what the most actionable information to come out of that might be, which is, asking deeper questions about how things have been and how alternative histories that could have occurred that tell us more about the way in which our world might be vulnerable to things that we're not thinking about as much as we should be. And then also how the changes that we are seeing and that we are unfortunately going to continue to see for a while, to be honest about the fact that there is going to be a considerable amount of additional warming, and so there is going to be a strong role for adaptation and adaptation relevant physical climate science that actually gives us the specific kind of information that we need. And that's no easy task for a variety of practical and scientific reasons that we can get into if there's interest. But I think that, you really, again, it gets back to the fact you have to ask the questions using tools and data sets that are actually able to allow you to address the things you're trying to address. And it turns out that that may sound really obvious, but it's often not what we're doing at present.
All right, I want to ask a few more questions, but then we have some questions that we received. And so, Jesse, I want to go back to you. And this is of great interest to me. And when I think of human migration, and then you have the whole discipline around managed retreat. And, Columbia does their, I think it's every year, sometimes it's every 2 years, where they have
Every 2 years.
Every 2 years, bring a bunch of experts together. And they're not necessarily the same thing. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but could you maybe elaborate on that? Is managed retreat really just a more structured way to think about human migration? Is it just kind of a developed country construct? Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons we use the language of human mobility is because it speaks to a wide variety of climatic and non-climatic conditions. And mobility itself can be understood in terms of time and space. And in fact, in a kind of spatial construct of it all, most people tend to think that most movement of people in response to climate impacts will be fairly local. Intra-county, for instance, has sort of been the general thinking along the way for some time now. It's not necessarily about transcontinental migration in broader terms. So, with that as a sort of background, right? There's a lot of non-climatic considerations of inequality and affordability and labor mobility and other things that play into this. And so that background's important. Managed relocation falls under this broader umbrella as a set of policies associated with moving people and moving infrastructure, moving an economic base on some level, as I previously referenced. In the United States, that primarily has to do with buyouts, home buyouts, and properties in very high-risk areas, or perhaps even using eminent domain. Interestingly enough, there's about 200 observed examples in the course of about 200 years of the United States and various state and territorial entities moving entire communities. We actually have a fair amount of experience in moving communities. I think we think of that now as a kind of a very draconian scale of operation. But most of the discourse today domestically in the United States is basically moving homes and a few collection of homes in high-risk areas. But more broadly, people recognize that as we operate to think about land use and planning, not just how we build, but where we build. I mean, California, we should shift our conversation to talk about land use and Chapter 7 and in California, because it's a land use question and it has to do with land economy and affordability and other political considerations. So as we move from these kind of, micro interventions associated with buyouts in people's homes to thinking fundamentally about land use regulation and the infrastructural economy behind that and the real estate and housing economy behind that, I think managed retreat is probably the less preferred language. I think managed relocation now is the dominant language, but that discourse is maturing, and it's maturing rapidly because we have to understand the role of public investment and public intervention in a broad swath of human experiences.
Great, fantastic. All right, Valerie, I want to jump to a question that we already have. I think this is very interesting, and I'm directing it towards you. And so what factors feed into whether population movement is short-term displacement or long-term migration, and how can this proactively be managed to improve outcomes? And yeah, I'm interested in your answer.
I hope Jesse and I agree. No, I think that the way I've thought about it is sort of disaster or climate event specific. And also it sort of complements, I don't want to reiterate everything Jesse says, but it is so context specific to the extent of I've, studied floods in, what happens when there's a flood in Bangladesh and Pakistan, right? A place where these are places that have monsoon rainfall every year and sort of are accustomed to flooding. And I think social scientists understand, as we, that humans are adaptable. So to the extent that a lot of these patterns are repeated, households find ways to sort of ensure themselves. It could be migration, it could be temporary migration, or it could be building your house on stilts. It could be diversifying crops that are more resilient to flooding. And so, in these contexts, oftentimes associated with flooding, we often see that flooding sort of causes a more temporary displacement. But some of that also could be driven by the fact that you see a lot of humanitarian aid that comes with a major cyclone or a major flooding event. And so, if you sort of have infrastructure that's easy to rebuild, that'll bring people back to their place of origin. So I think it really, really depends on the type of event, and it really depends oftentimes on the type of resources that the disaster will bring following the event. There are also studies done, that what happened in, Asia when the massive tsunami hit. There are studies that show that in that context, there was so much humanitarian aid and investment post the disaster that oftentimes those places are better than they were prior to the disaster, because there was so much more investment into those areas. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but you can't look at these singular, you have to sort of look at the context when you evaluate the impact of an event. I think with droughts, I'm going to say it's much more complicated. At least in the African context, you see that a lot of movement is sort of related to long-term droughts, and that can be on a more permanent basis because there are fewer sort of institutions or way to cope with a long-term drought. There aren't water resources, so eventually the household has to move. They can't maintain their livelihoods. But if you have events like storms and flooding that attract a lot of resources to rebuild, then oftentimes the displacement will be short term.
Okay, great. And Jesse, do you want to do a follow-up there?
Yeah, thank you for that opportunity. And I always learn so much. And one thing I just want to add as an addendum to my prior commentary is, for as much as we study mobility, there's also a huge and a very important frame for understanding immobility, right? And that helps to explain a lot of the challenges we have about who moves forward and who gets left behind and under what conditions. And I think that's a really very important thing to understand. Why is that so important? It's important because in the context of relocation or government intervention and policy, we tend to think through democratic means and institutions that we will make decisions, often locally, about who moves forward and who gets left behind. I think we believe that on some fundamental level, but the reality is, and the evidence is steering in the other direction, that in fact, it's the private sector that is making and having a great deal of influence about the capacities and ultimately capabilities of who gets to move forward and who gets left behind. That means that in some cases, sure, we will have episodic extreme events that will drive and displace people, but it also means that the chronic nature of stress, the cost, the affordability, and the accessibility measures of the market risk premium, whatever it may be, that's imposed upon climate change, that itself, without any independent episodic event, will drive people out and will force a change in the preferences of how people find value in one place over the other for the course of their lives, in the course of how they plant and make investments in their community and in their own well-being. So it's very important, I think, to give recognition to the role, unfortunately, that the economy and the market economy is playing in steering both mobility and immobility.
All right, thanks. And I forgot to give credit. That was Kristen Coda from Cal OES who asked that question originally from Valerie. Thank you, Kristen, for asking that question. And so for Daniel, I've got a question here. I'm going to put you a bit on the spot, but I think you're the best one to potentially answer this. And this is from Dale Steele from 350 Sacramento. Is there thought or presence now of a dashboard reporting real-time climate disaster / human migration activity? This would seem like a powerful tool if widely accessible. Yes, get on this, Mr. Climate Modeler.
Yeah, there's a lot of these dashboards out there. They've been out there for years. They're a little bit disparate. NOAA, the federal agency, has maintained a database on disasters, a pretty impressive one over the years. There have been various sort of NGO, private sector endeavors to sort of map these as well. There's an ever evolving data set of climate change attribution studies, so sort of literally mapping on the globe where there have been research studies done regarding specific extreme events and climate change. I think one challenge is that the physical data is very different from the human data. They're not. It's different people who have domain expertise in interpreting that information, and there are very different ways of ascertaining it. So for physical hazards, for example, you might be able to get information from climate models or from weather observations, and for demographic data, you might need census information, or there might even be some remote sensing you can do from satellites, for example, to look where people are, or looking at self-aggregated cell phone data, as was mentioned earlier. But I think one challenge is the human mobility part and the weather and climate and the natural hazard part. The data is sufficiently different that I think there are real barriers to syncing up and getting it all in the same place in sort of a unified format. And frankly, it's really hard independently to get that data for either of them separately, and then you add a layer of complexity by trying to stitch it together and contextualize it in some meaningful way. I mean, I think that it would be really valuable, but it's a huge task, and especially in this moment with all of the chaos in the federal government and how it's now essentially illegal to talk about humans and disasters and things like equity and socioeconomic. Some of these terms are now terms that will get you banned from federal grants as of a couple of weeks ago. The question is, I think, who is going to support this? And so I do think there are opportunities for states to support this. I do think there are opportunities for private philanthropy to support this. I wish it weren't going to fall to states and philanthropy to fund this kind of thing, but I think it probably is in this moment, at least in the US. Of course, there's other places in the world, but in a US context, I think this is really important to do. It's not easy to do, both for practical, and I know it's boring to talk about funding, but who is going to support these endeavors? What kinds of institutions? I think states really should be stepping up, because a lot of that data too, especially on the human side, is available at state or sub-state sort of subunit level to begin with. So I'm less an expert on that side of things. These data sets do exist certainly for weather and climate, but I think stitching it all together is where the real challenge is. And it is possible to do harm by doing it poorly, by the way. And so, I would hesitate to just jump into it without actually really thinking it through. And so I think that's why it's important to really have, full-time experts in the room who really know what they're doing to make that happen.
All right, thanks, Daniel. So this question could be for all of you. And of course, the big 800-pound gorilla in the room is that we had these wildfires in Southern California, these catastrophically bad fires. And there was even debate going on with this panel before we presented, like, is this just going to be about California and the wildfires? And we didn't want it to be about that, because there's some broader issues here, but we can't ignore it either. And so maybe you guys want to just take a crack. Fundamentally, do you think these wildfires will drive a significant number of people to migrate away from this region? And just as some anecdotal, here in Arizona, I have some real estate friends, and they're like, well, we've heard some people that want to move from California. That's anecdotal. That's not data, but it's just like, it's cheaper real estate here. What do you guys think? I mean, who wants to take their first crack at that? Who'd like to? Because I'd like to hear from all of you.
I'll jump in the interest of time. I'd love to hear questions from the audience as well. It's a good question. I think it's all about scale and proportion, obviously. There are going to be people, and there always have been, or at least in recent fire seasons, we see some seasonality actually in out migration from California. There's not great numbers behind it. It's most likely people who, again, have the wealth and the means and some labor mobility function to be able to move to lower cost markets. We know that it's happening. We just don't fully understand or appreciate the scale of it. Again, it's often a fairly localized reshuffling relating to housing and housing cost burdens and how people find shelter and try to maintain connections with community and jobs and the like. So, of course, it's very destabilizing. Has been for a number of years observed outmigration that comes along with that. And by the way, we see this in Australia, we see this in other places around the world. So there are responses, but we just don't really understand the full scale of it now.
Valerie.
Well, you know, this is a topic dear to my heart because my family was affected by the Palisade fires, and I grew up in LA. But I would say that it's the middle class is probably going to be affected by these things more than the upper class. I think a lot of people that are probably moving to Arizona and other places outside that are leaving California are probably going to be the middle class. And I think it's a variety of things. I don't think we can just blame it on climate exposure, but I think as the cost of insurance is rising, for sure that's going to affect the middle class more than it's going to affect the upper class. The upper class has already started identifying ways in which they can find insurance in Ohio and other states. So I think it's going to cause probably more inequality within California. But again, there was only a recent paper published in Nature Communications looking at wildfires and mobility in the United States. There's very limited research on this. So I agree with Jesse. I think that we don't know so much yet about what's going to happen.
And Daniel, you've obviously been talking about this a lot. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the outcomes in a place like Pacific Palisades or Altadena are going to be different than they were in a place like Paradise, California, for example, where we have these whole communities wiped out by fire. I agree that some people will probably leave, but I'm also virtually certain that these places will once again be populated by about as many people as they were originally. But that's partly because these are such desirable places to live, and I do think it will not be the same people in many cases who were there previously. So there will be displacement. There will probably be some level of outmigration, as the other two panelists have mentioned. It probably will be demographically different than before, and that dynamic here may in fact be different than some other places where there's been displacement, because there are people who are going to come in and fill the void in this kind of highly desirable setting, even knowing the risks, even knowing the costs. I also just would briefly touch upon a related point, which is that folks often ask me, where should we live? Where are the climate havens? Where are the low risk locations? And my answer is almost always, I don't believe in the existence of climate havens. I think that this is actually a pretty misleading notion for two reasons. One is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, often we are insufficiently circumspect about the range of big bad things that can happen in any given place at any given time. That's not even a climate change statement. That's just a background natural world statement. But also, there are sort of two dimensions, or there's more than two, but there's two big dimensions that I think of in terms of which places are most at risk. Are you more willing to live in a city that is accustomed to big earthquakes, for example, if you're afraid of earthquakes, or are you instead going to move to a place where earthquakes are rare? A lot of folks will say, I want to go somewhere where earthquakes are rare because I'm unlikely to experience one. But the conditional risk, if you experience an earthquake in that place that is not prepared for one, is actually, in many cases, a lot higher than if you live in a place where earthquakes are expected and regular and where the seismic code is up to date. Personally, I would often rather live in places that see more of a disaster or more of a natural hazard and therefore more prepared for it, than in a place that could still see it, but it's unlikely, and therefore there's less preparedness. And so there's this dimension of, what are you trying to optimize for? And it's sort of a game of what are you most afraid of, but that also assumes you have the privilege and the financial ability to make that a priority of where you live, which most people don't in the world and in the U.S. and even in California. But even if you have that consideration, it's sort of pick your poison. Where if you're going to move out of earthquake country, maybe now you're in hurricane territory, or vice versa. Are you moving away from wildfire risk zone in Southern California onto a place where you have extreme heat and drought in Arizona? It's undeniably a cheaper place to live, but there are trade-offs there too, even just from a pure natural hazard perspective. So I just thought I'd raise that sort of as an addendum to that last point.
Okay, this could be good. Potential conflict. Jesse, I'm coming back to you and climate havens and Duluth. Can you kind of weigh in on that, what just Daniel just said?
Yeah. Interestingly enough, the concept of climate havens is often misattributed to me, and it's somewhat frustrating, I guess. Climate havens, as far as I can tell, in the underlying language and nomenclature, is a creation of the media, and there are no doubt places that have trade-offs, right? As Daniel sets up for us. We know after the Tohoku earthquake, many people move out of tsunami zones and they move on to hillsides, which actually have a objectively higher measure of risk in terms of landslides and flooding and things like that. So there's a long history of substitution of risks and relative to affordability and accessibility and all these other conditions associated with the cost of living. This is well known. But that being said, there is at least a perception among people that there are places, and I think this is also an objective reality, that there are places that are higher, lower levels of risk in long-term associated with climate. Now, we can't fully appreciate that because we don't fully understand the full nature of impacts. But there are places that are, let's say, are on a continuum of inferior to superior when it relates to a range of impacts. Nothing's perfect. Everywhere that you move that one might identify as being a climate haven is certainly going to be at some risk, right? Asheville, North Carolina, there was some component of people moving there that thought that, hey, this is a place that I can hide out from the worst of coastal impacts. And of course, they get hit by a flood. That's just the nature of it. So on some level, the question that I've asked and tried to understand is, why did climate havens become a kind of popular concept? Like, what is the origins of that? And I think the origins of that are that people are desperate for optimism. This is my own conjecture. I have no basis for this empirically. But I think people are desperate for optimism. They want to see that they have agency and control over their lives in something that is entirely uncontrollable. And they want to think that, wow, I could possibly live in a place that has a sustainable footprint or a sustainable future. I don't think we should fully reject that outright, because I think that we have to understand that there is opportunities in the movement of people and capital. And we need to understand that so that we can incorporate that into the trade-offs of who moves forward and who gets left behind.
All right, great. We are almost toward the end. I just going to probably have another question or two, and I want to go to Valerie, and I'm going to ask you one of the questions that came through. And just following up on that, climate havens, I get hassled by all my East Coast friends. I moved to Tucson about 8 years ago, and they're like, why didn't you move to Wisconsin? Why didn't you move to Minnesota? And so Jesse and I had that conversation once in a while. All right, so Valerie, this is from Jessica Bolivar. Could you discuss the challenges and opportunities that human mobility presents when adapting urban environments to climate change? And maybe not your particular expertise, but I think you could speak to that. Maybe.
Well, I mean, I can from personal experience. It sort of connects back to what Daniel was saying. So, why would someone move to Arizona when we know like temperature is increasing and heat is so horrible, right? I live in Phoenix. And I think that, again, it comes back to, exposure and infrastructure around that exposure. So I feel much more comfortable with not having a blackout and electricity blackout. And we have pretty reliable air conditioning. So we're allowed, like, until we have the water problem, the heat problem is not such a huge issue for us. And so I think with urban areas in the United States, to the extent that there's that infrastructure there, I don't think there's going to be a big push for people to leave. Now, we have seen some settings where, when the New York subway was flooded, for example, and people were sort of stuck in their apartments, as we see more and more of those, I would call tail events, it's going to be much more difficult to change the infrastructure to accommodate those type of hazards, unless the local governments are more proactive. So to the extent that governments are proactive and have these sort of mechanisms in place or investments in place, I think we won't see a lot of mobility coming out of urban areas. So I think this is probably a question for Jesse, like to what extent there's been more proactive adaptation planning in cities, and I don't know if you know this, Jesse, which cities are probably more proactive than others.
Yeah, I don't want to take up too much airtime. I've said enough. Generally, the larger and more cities have the capacity and the institutional capacity, and have probably done the most work. Also, counties with the highest population density, right? So the poorer counties, the less insulated areas, I'll give you, there's probably, I don't know, 55,000 jurisdictions in the United States or something like that. There's probably only a couple hundred adaptation plans that are done at a municipal level, and we probably only have reasonable evidence of implementation in a few dozens, most of which are highly concentrated by dollar volume in places like New York and LA and San Francisco. So for the most part, not much is done across the board. About 95% of the country is covered by a mitigation plan at a local level in terms of climate mitigation. In terms of adaptation, at my best guess, it's maybe about a third of the U.S. population. And again, implementation is different from planning as to where we stand.
And Daniel, I want you to close this out before I close this out. Maybe take a minute and just, could you give some advice? We have probably very diverse people that are watching this, and any advice on how they could learn more about this, and if they're policymakers, maybe some next steps, because we're just beginning this.
Yeah, that's a broad mandate. I think I've mentioned this a few times in this hour, and I'm realizing that for some folks it's just an incredibly obvious statement, but for others, including a lot of folks in the policy world that I've been talking with over the past several years, it's maybe not so trivial, which is that we really need to be thinking carefully about whether we're asking questions, first of all, that are answerable using the data that exists, whether it's the physical climate data, the human mobility migration data, whatever it is. Sometimes we're asking questions and we're sort of assuming that we have to get an answer to a question that we just don't have good enough data to answer. So I think maybe the first step in all of this is working with people who really deeply understand whatever the data is, whether it's the physical hazard data, the climate data, or the human data, the demographic data, the movement data, and asking, what kinds of questions are actually tractable? And from that, what are the most kinds of constructive paths that we can pursue with what we know we're actually going to be able to give high quality answers to in the first place, rather than trying to ask questions that might very well be important and relevant, and if we could get good answers to them, actionable, but we're kind of missing that first step, the ability to actually quantify what we need to. For me, that's sort of that first step, is involving the folks who understand the nuances of the data at that first step of asking the initial questions, so that we're asking questions that are both addressable and then actionable as well.
All right, fantastic. I'm going to wrap things up. First off, I want to thank panelists, Daniel, Valerie, and Jesse for participating and sharing your expertise. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate this, and especially for everyone who's joined in to listen. And I think these things are going to be recorded and available in the future. Julianne, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Oh, thank you all so much. Thank you especially to our extraordinary panelists, the amazing staff across our three organizations who made this all possible, and further thanks to the hundreds of you who joined us in the audience today, especially those of you who submitted such thoughtful questions to drive conversation, including from several state agencies. If you'd like to watch this briefing again or share it with a colleague, it will be posted on our website. And stay tuned for the announcement of our second webinar in this series. With that, it is top of the hour, and we're just grateful for your attention and the shared leadership in this timely and significant topic. Thank you all so much.